Hey everybody, thanks for watching. I titled this video, The Ignorance of the Black Muslim. Now, if anybody is offended by that title, you need just look at the definition of ignorance. It simply means lack of knowledge, lack of education, or lack of awareness. And I believe had you been aware or had the knowledge and education about Islam before you joined, you would not have joined. So my mission is to show you something in this video that you did not know before you joined this religion. And had you known, I really believe you would not have joined the religion. Now, it's real easy for a person to just listen to some information and make up their mind and say, you know what, it sounds good, I want in. But if you don't take the time out to do the research and really look at what somebody's telling you, then how do you know if what they're saying is true? Just because it's in a book doesn't make it true. And I don't understand how so many black people can blindly follow something that is largely taken away from their only one experience on this planet without at least finding out if it's true. Now, one of the things I speak about in my videos is religion is control. Religion destroys common sense. It destroys rationale. And people will say, well, ain't nothing wrong with my common sense. Just because I'm religious doesn't mean that, I lost my common sense. But then these same people will not accept facts. They will not accept things that you can touch, that you can actually prove is real, that you can actually go and find on this planet in real life. They won't accept these things. They will rather choose a book that we can't find the existence of none of the people in the book. We can't find out who wrote the book. We can't prove the book is real. We can't prove anything about it. And the stories that the book speaks of are stories that resemble fairy tales, of stories that cannot possibly be true and have happened on this planet. But they accept these things, but won't accept facts and truth. And they will say that it's nothing wrong with their common sense. There's nothing wrong with their rationale. Now, there's so much information out here about this subject. There's so many people speaking against this whole religion thing. But the problem is nobody is listening to reason. Nobody is listening to the facts. Nobody wants to accept the proof. And it's because of ego. It's ego. People don't want to admit that they was wrong. People don't want to admit they made a mistake. People don't want to have to say that, damn, I shouldn't have done that, because of their ego. And you owe it to yourself to find out if something that I'm following, something that's going to change the way that I eat, the way that I dress, the way that I treat my girl, the way that I raise my kids, the way that I look at the world, the way that I look at other people. You owe it to yourself to find out if something that's going to change something so important in your life is true or not. You owe it to yourself to find out if it's real, because if you don't, who are you hurting with your ego? You're only hurting yourself. Okay, I'm not going to sit here and preach too much. I want to get into straight information. And we have to, as black people, we have to stop following these religions that have destroyed our people. We got to stop blindly following people who are not us. And that's the fact. We got to look at our past and look at what was going on before we were prisoners of war or slaves. We got to look at what our people was doing, because when you start doing the research, you see everybody stole from us. Everybody copied from Africa. They copied from Kemet, Egypt. And they created a system that's basically designed to keep us entrapped and keep us blind from who we were, because for some reason they are scared of us returning back to who we were. Now, most black Muslims don't realize that the Arabs were the first slave traders. They were the first ones to basically put black people in bondage and make money off of our slave labor. Now, I want you to listen to an Arab tell you about what was going on during that time. Now,
I must admit that I too, among hundreds of millions of educated people, was under the impression that the African slave trade was the sole responsibility of the Christian Europeans, the white race. That is, until I started exploring the subject in greater depth, and especially after reading an incredibly enlightening book called The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa by John Alambila Azuma. My whole perspective and understanding has changed dramatically, and I would like you to tell us more about this subject.
The success of Muhammadan Islam in deceiving, misinforming, deforming, and contorting both history and reality over a period of almost 1400 years has been astounding. That is, until now. The greatest tragedy about this particular subject is that most of the descendants of African slavery, the black people in the Americas, around the world, as well as among the African blacks are totally ignorant of the actual facts. Before we lose the concentration of our listeners, I would like to make the following statement and then prove it. That the worst, most inhumane and most diabolical institution of the black African slave trade was initiated, refined, perpetrated and implemented by the Mohammedan Arabs and later aided and abetted by the black converts to Mohammedan Islam. I predict that, as usual, the two subcultures, those of denial of facts and of political correctness, will attack us without once disproving a single statement and or conclusion that we make. Slavery was not created by the white races, because it has existed throughout human history and practiced by every tribe, culture, civilization, racial group and religion. In fact, the very word slavery has its root in the name Slav, based upon the Slavic peoples of Europe who were subjugated by other Europeans. It is not common knowledge that the Arabic word abd is synonymous with the meaning of slave. For example, Abdullah means literally the slave of Allah, and that in the language of the Arabs, all black peoples are called abid, plural, for slaves. While much has been written concerning the transatlantic slave trade, surprisingly little attention has been paid to the Islamic slave trade across the Sahara, the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. While the European involvement in the African transatlantic slave trade to the Americas lasted for just over 3 centuries, the Arab involvement in the African slave trade has lasted 14 centuries, and in some parts of the Mohammedan world is still continuing to this day. The birth of Mohammedan Islam and its conquests brought about the birth of institutionalized, systematized, and religiously sanctioned slave trade on a massive and global scale. In fact, the Quran allows the taking of slaves as booty or reward for wars of aggression against any and all unbelievers, most of the human population. This has led to an enormous number of so-called holy wars, jihad in Arabic. There was and is absolutely nothing holy about these wars, which are primarily to plunder, slaughter, rape, subjugate and rob other human beings of their wealth, produce, freedom and dignity. Mohammedan Muslim states and tribes attacked other non-Muslim groups to achieve these objectives. Although Islamic jurisprudence laid down regulations for the treatment of slaves, however, incredible and heinous abuses have occurred throughout the history of Mohammedan Islam. By the Middle Ages, the Arabic word abd was in general used to denote a black slave, while the word mamluk referred to a white slave. Ibn Khaldun, 1332 to 1406, the preeminent Islamic medieval historian and social thinker, wrote, "The Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, because they have attributes that are quite similar to dumb animals." It should also be noted that black slaves were castrated based on the assumption that the blacks had an ungovernable sexual appetite. When the Fatimid Caliphate came to power in Egypt, they slaughtered all the tens of thousands of black military slaves and raised an entirely new slave army. Some of these slaves were conscripted into the army at age 10. From Persia to Egypt to Morocco, slave armies from 30,000 to up to 250,000 became commonplace. The Islamic slave trade took place across the Sahara Desert, from the coast of the Red Sea, and from East Africa across the Indian Ocean. The Trans-Sahara trade was conducted along 6 major slave routes. Just in the 19th century, for which we have more accurate records, 1.2 million slaves were brought across the Sahara into the Middle East, as well as a further 450,000 down the Red Sea and 442,000 from the East African coastal ports. That is a total of 2 million black slaves just in the 1800s. At least 8 million more were calculated to have died before reaching the Muslim slave markets. A comparison of the Islamic slave trade to the American slave trade reveals some extremely interesting contrasts. While 2 out of every 3 slaves shipped across the Atlantic were men, the proportions were reversed in the Islamic slave trade. 2 women for every man were enslaved by the Muslims. While the mortality rate of slaves being transported across the Atlantic was as high as 10%, the percentage of slaves dying in transit in the Trans-Sahara and East African slave market was a staggering 80 to 90%. While almost all the slaves shipped across the Atlantic were for agricultural work, most of the slaves destined for the Muslim Middle East were for sexual exploitation as concubines, in harems, and for military service. While many children were born to the slaves in the Americas, the millions of their descendants are citizens in Brazil and the United States today. Very few descendants of the slaves that ended up in the Middle East survived. While most slaves who went to the Americas could marry and have families, most of the male slaves destined for the Middle East were castrated, and most of the children born to the women were killed at birth. It is estimated that possibly as many as 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic, 95% of which went to South and Central America, mainly to Portuguese, Spanish, and French possessions. Only 5% of the slaves ended up in what we call the United States today. However, a minimum of 28 million Africans were enslaved in the Muslim Middle East. Since at least 80% of those captured by Muslim slave traders were calculated to have died before reaching the slave markets, it is believed that the death toll from 1400 years of Arab and Muslim slave raids into Africa could have been as high as 112 millions. When added to the number of those sold in the slave markets, the total number of African victims of the Trans-Saharan and East African slave trade could be significantly higher than 140 million people. What is obscene about this whole subject is the Muhammadan, Muslim, and Arab culture of denial regarding their complicity in the African slave trade, as well as the ignorance of black Muslims about the reality of their past and present conditions. The statistics and reports above are based upon the logbooks kept at the African slave ports, ship logs, travelers' reports, eyewitness accounts, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, the facts and reality of Muhammadan Islam's complicity in the slave trade and their inhuman depravity are infinitely more devastating.
Now, I think the video speaks for itself, and you got so many black Muslims out there today, and it's a shame because they're talking about Islam is a black religion. This is an African religion. Now, when you look at that, come on. If we are their people, how could they do such a thing to us? If this is our religion, how could they do that to us? Think about that. They were brutal. They were worse than the fucking white people. So how can you follow them? And then you got so many black people saying that, you know what, they occupy Egypt, they occupy the pyramids, so this is somehow giving validity to this being a African religion. Because some of the Arabs will say, you know what, this is the African civilization, we came and conquered it. Some of the tour guides will tell you that. They'll tell you the truth because you can't hide it when you get there. You'll see so much black faces all over the hieroglyphics on the wall. But you got to ask yourself this. If it was their civilization, if their people did in fact build the pyramids, what kind of people would dig up their dead and put them on display? Would you dig up, would they dig up George Washington, dig up his body, put his fucking sarcophagus out there for people to make money on? Would they do that? No. So what kind of people would dig up their own ancestors from the greatest civilization ever on this planet and put them on display? What kind of people would deface the greatest monument on this planet, which is the pyramids, because they defaced it. The pyramids were smooth on each side. They chiseled off all of the limestone. There wasn't steps like you see today. It was a smooth, flat surface. And they chiseled off the limestone to build their mosques and build their temples. What kind of people would do that to the greatest monuments on the planet if it was their own? It's not theirs, it's ours. It's African. It's not theirs at all. Now, you have to really realize that slavery didn't stop with the Arabs. They're still on slavery today. And people are saying that Islam is true because it's on the rise. It's the fastest growing religion on the planet. So many people are converting to Islam and they're not realizing because they don't do no research that they are being forced, just like the Arabs were. And I'm going to show this later on, that the Arabs themselves were forced into Islam. But so many Africans are becoming Muslims today because they are being forced and they are still enslaving black people. And here's the proof. So, yeah.
the government needed to do was to lay on a couple of Antonov cargo planes, and all of these people would have been here in a few hours and in comfort rather than 3 weeks in a cattle truck.
For centuries, Sudanese Arabs have been taking the black tribal people from Sudan as slaves for their personal use, as well as exporting them to the Middle East.
It's like a cow meat in the butchery. You can see. We want to ask what is going on here.
While the peace talks are at effect in Nairobi between the Sudan government and the SPLM-SPLA, the Sudan government has launched its inhuman act today and targeted Mololkon on the 23rd of June, year 2002. As now, you are seeing an innocent life lost to the shrapnels of Antonov. Yeah, this is one of the examples we should show to the international community and those who have been talking all the time that Sudan government is genuine in its quest for peace. A peace with such acts. A peace covered with blood. The blood of the innocent who don't know what they are up for. These are the victims of the real Southern Sudanese people who are left to the mercy of NIF in Khartoum and their allies worldwide.